All right, welcome everybody to another TV Club bonus episode on the podcast. And I'm super excited today to be talking about the Book of Boba Fett with a fantastic crew of guests. I've even got my Grogu sweater just to bring some festivity to the discussion. And today I have a wonderful panel to discuss the first season of the show. My first guest is Gareth L. Powell. He's the award-winning author of the Embers of War series, including Embers of War, Fleet of Knives, and Light of Impossible Stars, as well as the Ack-Ack-Macaque series and more. And his latest novel, Stars and Bones, releases next week, so keep an eye out for that. Glad to have you here. How are you, Gareth?
Hi, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And next up is J.S. Dewis, making her second appearance on the show, so welcome back. Jenny is the author of The Last Watch and the Exiled Fleet, books 1 and 2 in the Divide series, and she has experience in screenwriting and film editing. So I'm eager to get her perspectives on Boba Fett. So how are you doing, Jenny? Glad to have you here.
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. And last but not least, we have Dianne Dotson. She is the author of the Questreson saga, as well as a science writer, content writer and manager, short story editor, watercolorist, and illustrator. So in general, she's a modern day Renaissance woman. And she also has a degree in ecology and evolutionary biology. So hopefully you can clear up some of the iffy science behind the Sarlacc pit and whatever else comes up during the discussion. So welcome to the show, Diane.
Thank
how are
you,
you?
Adrian. I'm doing great. Thank you.
Cool. So kicking the discussion into hyperdrive, what is your relationship with the Star Wars universe, and what did you think of the original Boba Fett character as he was portrayed in Return of the Jedi? So we'll start with you, Diane.
Well, I saw Star Wars as the first movie I remember seeing at age 3 in 1977 on the big screen. My brother, Greg, had already seen it, and I was taken by the whole family and fell instantly in love with R2-D2, and I was mesmerized by Tatooine. I didn't know there could be two suns. And so that kind of catapulted an interest in astronomy early on, as I realized that, yes, that was not only possible, it actually did exist.
Mm-hmm.
And so that got me thinking in terms of stories and adventures. I loved having a strong woman character stand up to evil. Resonated with me. I was growing up in the country in semi-rural East Tennessee, and a farm boy becomes a hero, so I loved that. And that was my introduction to Star Wars. I became a super fan with The Empire Strikes Back, which is still my favorite film of all of them. And, I watching The Empire Strikes Back getting like, oh no, who is this person who is going to get Han Solo, and it was Boba Fett, of course. So, and I thought, he even then struck me as really intriguing and not quite like, I couldn't really tell, I thought obviously he was not a good guy, but he didn't strike me as Empire bad either. So I liked him from the beginning. I liked his jetpack and his neat tools and his cool Hamlet and his little capelet thing, So I always found Boba intriguing, and that feeling would evolve in interesting ways through the prequels, and then finally The Mandalorian, and then the Book of Boba Fett. So I've loved watching that progression of character development over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too. And I'll let everyone else go before I jump into my my thoughts on Boba, and we'll also touch a little bit on his how he's represented in the prequel trilogy. But Gareth, what about you? What's your sort of relationship with the Star Wars universe, and your impression of Boba Fett, seeing him for the first time?
Well, my relationship is that, I was 6 or 7 years old when the first film came out. I didn't actually see it at the cinema, but I got to know it through the Marvel Comics, the Marvel comic adaptation. So I'd pretty much memorized the entire script by the time I actually got to see it on a VHS copy at a friend's house one day. But I remember the first one I saw was Empire Strikes Back at the cinema, which was just A, amazing, and B, I think traumatized a generation when at the end the good guys didn't win. And it was like, what the hell's going on? This isn't how films work. But it was amazing at the same time. It just absolutely blew my mind. I was aware of Boba Fett before I saw the film because I collected the small Star Wars action figures, and if you saved up a token, you could send off the Boba Fett action figure. I think he was only exclusively available as a special offer, so everybody at school had to have him because he was the special offer, and we didn't really know anything about him apart from he was a bounty hunter, and he was so he had this mystique, the same as kind of Lee Van Cleef in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. He's just, you can tell by looking at him he's a badass, but you don't really know anything about him. And I think he had a lot of that that appeal. I've got with me here, back from I think the late 70s or early 80s,
wow,
a rather
dude,
larger
awesome.
Boba. Yeah, he's with a grappling hook backpack, but and a little hole you can look through to see the rangefinder.
Man, that's so
you want
cool.
to blow something up. Yeah, so Boba Fett was kind of like my favorite character for a long time. And that was one of the reasons when I heard that they were going to do a TV series, I was deeply against it because of the aforementioned mystique I thought was the appeal of the character. I thought if you over-explain him or he takes his helmet off, it's going to ruin everything. But I don't necessarily still think that.
Well, I'm excited to get your impressions on that. Jenny, first we'll toss it over to you. If you can share your history with Star Wars and your first impressions of Boba Fett.
Yeah, so I was a kid when the remastered versions came out in the theater, but I had watched the original versions on Laserdisc prior to that because my dad's a big movie file, so we had watched those many times. So I was personally offended by the changes that they had made. We all were, I think, a little bit. It seemed very strange to us. So I kind of remember that as being, I was pretty young, but I remember that as kind of being my first interaction. And then, I was in, I think, middle school when the original trilogy came out, and that's really when I got really into Star Wars. I started reading the tie-in novels and all that stuff, and there was a specific series of tie-in novels that followed Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan when Obi-Wan was a Padawan, and I was obsessed with it. Like, I read every book multiple times, and I just thought it was the coolest idea in the world that we could get this insight into these characters that you don't really get to find out too much about in the movies, really, or where they come from. And yeah, that was really what I think ultimately hooked me into it. And then, of course, I started making my own backyard movies with lightsabers. And that's when rotoscoping first became a thing you could actually do in After Effects if you could find the programs from somewhere. So I started doing all that. And yeah, it really honestly kind of fueled my transition into cinema and filmmaking and stuff as well. So as far as Boba Fett, honestly, I have a weird relationship with him. I don't remember my first impressions of him as far as like when I first saw the movies, but I always remember being the least obsessed person with him. Like, all my friends were like, Boba Fett's so cool. And I was like, yeah, he's fine, but he just always seemed sort of a throwaway character to me. Like, he was just there to serve a point in the plot, and it was cool and good. And like Gareth was saying, like, the tech was awesome, and like, that stuff was all fine, but I never felt like a connection to him at all. So when they announced the Boba Fett, I was like, really? But also, okay, let's do this. Like, let's dig into what that could be. And yeah, I was pretty interested to see how they handled it. So
cool. Well, I love how Star Wars played such an intimate role in sort of your development with filmmaking and all that. Because we've talked about it during the cinematic storytelling panel we did for TBRCon, and it's just kind of cool to get more of like a fleshed out origin story for young Jenny making Star Wars lightsaber videos in her backyard. So I think it's really awesome.
We've got them all on tape somewhere. I can dig them up at some point.
Nice. And as for me personally, I have a strange relationship with Star Wars and Boba Fett personally, not in a bad way. It's just kind of crazy how it all coalesced. So I grew up in the 90s, and my oldest brother is a huge Trekkie, and as much as he liked Star Wars, he would never downplay Star Trek and try and pimp out Star Wars as opposed to his beloved Star Trek. So for me, it was just kind of this like bombardment of Star Trek, and Star Wars slipped in a very interesting way. My first memory of Star Wars is my other older brother playing the Dark Forces video game on PC. And I was like, what is this? And then I just remember I mean, this is the mid 90s, I guess, but the really crappy pixelated Stormtrooper helmets stuck out to me so much. And I was like, what is this? It's really cool. And then he showed me like there's 3 movies. And I think I watched the remastered ones as well, Jenny. And then my first clear memory of actually just like seeing Star Wars and being really conscious of it was unfortunately the Phantom Menace, seeing that in theaters. Because the hype train had sort of built up, and I was like, oh, I've seen these Star Wars movies, and now they're doing the prequel trilogy. And I'm a young kid, and the main character is a young kid, even though Anakin in that movie is unfortunately not too well portrayed. But kid actors, you can only do so much. And then my memory of Boba Fett is kind of paired with how he was portrayed in the prequel trilogy with his father Jango Fett and the whole clone army thing in the second movie. I think it was the Clone Wars. And then I went back and watched the movies and remember the Return of the Jedi, where Boba Fett does seem like a bit of a throwaway character, and his death is just really cheesy to me. Where it's just kind of like, and he falls into the Sarlacc pit. And I laughed. Like I was probably 10 years old, 11 years old, and I just laughed at that, But I can kind of go back and understand the mystique that Gareth, you mentioned. And then Jenny, to your point, I think the reason Boba Fett may have gelled with so many people is because he's kind of like an avatar within the Star Wars world, where up to this point, he didn't really have too much of a clear personality or, even a face. It's like you can kind of put yourself inside of his armor and his helmet and assume the role of this badass bounty hunter. And that was kind of a cool thing to do, And then Gareth, you have those awesome collectible toys with the little like grappling hook on the back. I can just imagine people being like, I love this. I want to collect more. I want to just become this character and be a bounty hunter and all that, But I'm curious for all of you, you had a bit more of a clean introduction to Star Wars than I did, I guess. But what was it like for you seeing the prequel trilogy and how Boba Fett's history was sort of fleshed out with his father and the clone army and all that kind of stuff? So Diane, we'll start with you.
Well, that was one of actually my favorite parts about the prequels, and I have a mixed relationship with the prequels. There's some of it that I actually did enjoy and other parts that not so much. But I actually really did like the clone concept, and then it was revealed that Boba is, essentially a clone,
Yeah.
And it was unexpected. So I enjoyed it a lot, and I wondered what the implications might be long term. And, of course, it sets up the Clone Wars, so we instantly know, okay, that's finally, we know what that is now.
Yeah.
At least part of the answer to that question. And I don't know, it worked for me. And I didn't feel in that particular case that it took away from his character. I thought that it was, it was a good backstory to see that he might not have the most grounded life because his father was gone, and, you could kind of see that he was a lone wolf and, he kind of was going his own way. So I liked that about him. I didn't have a problem with it.
And it fits perfectly into the lone wolf bounty hunter lifestyle that he eventually solidified into.
He didn't have those attachments. And, like attachment keeps coming up as a theme in the Star Wars movies for Jedi. But, also for Boba, he literally had none after his father was gone. So, he's just trying to make his way in the universe.
Yeah.
Like,
all of us.
Yeah.
And Jenny, what about you? What was your impression of the prequel trilogies and how Boba resurfaced there?
Yeah, so I unapologetically loved the prequels trilogies. I remember being shocked and confused as to why people freaked out so much. Yeah, there were silly things and weird things, but I was like, they made more Star Wars, guys. Why are we complaining about it?
Yeah.
Just kind of how I felt about everything that's come out since. It's like, there might be mistakes or they could have done something else, but they're making more Star Wars content, and for that, I am grateful. So, I don't even know that I made the connection to it being Boba Fett immediately, although I went and saw them a lot in the theater, so I think I must have eventually, obviously it clicked that what that storyline then portrayed.
Mhm.
But I just remember liking I don't know. I thought it was interesting that they showed another child character, and I remember really relating to that fact because there just weren't that many young children in the series at all. So showing him and having him be in this very weird position, like unique position, and just the setting of that planet, I loved that setting. It was so cool and weird, and it's something I'd never seen in sci-fi before. So I remember those scenes a lot, and the battle sequences were cool in the rain, and the just everything about it was just really unique and interesting, and I remember those scenes very well, but I never really thought, because again, I didn't really care that much about Boba, so I was like, yeah, he's being a throwaway character again. He's a means to an end as far as explaining where this clone army came from, and then we're back to square one with him. So yeah, I think it was the same sort of thing where they wanted to put him in there to maybe as a bit of fan service to make sure that we know,
True.
we get him in there. And then I just kind of moved past it and thought a lot about the lightsabers and Jedi and Sith and
Yeah.
all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Kamino was a super cool planet. It's just
Yeah, it
like
was.
this, just like
Why would you build that
tormented
there? I
story.
don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's a secret facility and it's in
'Cause
the
it's
middle
awesome,
of
yeah.
hurricanes. It's cool. Whatever.
I'm obsessed with hidden planets because I wrote about one before I had seen that. And I thought, oh my God, yes, another hidden planet. I have a soft spot for hidden worlds.
Nice.
And Gareth, what about you? Your relationship with the prequel trilogy and how Boba was represented there?
I saw the prequel trilogy as they came out in the cinema, and very quickly excitement turned to less excitement in that the story that we're being told is basically the formation of Vader and how he becomes this terrifying thing. But we don't see
Mm-hmm.
any of that on the screen. All the important stuff that happens, like Dooku training Anakin, and then not Dooku, Palpatine, sorry, training Anakin after Anakin kills Dooku, and turning him into a Sith, all happens off screen. And what we see on screen is him moaning at Obi-Wan and mooning around over Padme. And I was hoping for this sort of big Shakespearean sort of Faustian descent into evil, and it's kind of it all happens somewhere else. It's like Tom Stoppard's play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which takes place in the wings of Hamlet. So all the important events of Hamlet happen just off stage, and occasionally one of the characters will come in and say, "Oh, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, there you are, I've been looking for you." And the rest of the time they're just sort of sat there marking time, and that's what the prequel trilogy felt like to me. It was a bunch of kind of, we've got this huge range of toys coming out, so for the Clone War, so let's get all them on the screen, and then the rest of it felt very much like there's so much more important stuff happening in this story, and we're just getting all these set piece action scenes instead. I found Anakin annoying as hell.
It felt a little bit like it felt a little bit like a CW drama, just a little bit like too what's the word, overacted in terms of the romantic, the romantic elements that were just taking up too much screen time between all the action scenes. My
issue with Boba in it is the same as my issue with Anakin in the first one, is they just make him a bit too cutesy. And a bit too kind of, gee whiz, yeah. And it just strikes a bit of a, a slightly wrong note for me that, if you were the son of this bounty hunter, living on a ship and being involved in all these space battles all the time, and you might be a little less kind of like woohoo. But I don't know. I mean, maybe it just didn't strike. I guess I just wasn't in a good mood when I saw all the prequels because they didn't ring it for me. I thought Jango Fett was very cool. I like his armor and the way it looks very cool. I like the fact that armor has worked its way down through the family. But I wasn't a huge fan of the prequels in general.
No, that's totally fair. I mean, yeah, some of the going back and watching those movies, a lot of the issues you brought up, it's just too much melodrama and not enough. I guess the balance is just off in this particular case of The Force, where the editing and all of that and the priority. Go ahead, Gareth.
The Clone War animated series, I think, got right a lot of what the prequel films got wrong. In the fact it showed a lot more of Anakin's character development. It made the Clone Wars actually into a big deal, the big deal it is, and we got a lot more of the sort of meat of the story than we did in the kind of flashy prequels. So I very much preferred the animated Clone Wars to the live action.
Yeah, I agree, and also he had a good emotional foil with Ahsoka Tano,
right?
Because before it's like he was just kind of like spouting off in this really annoying
Petulant.
way. Yeah, exactly. Petulant little boy, just like, oh, woe is me. And then just like, what have you done to me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Whereas in the Clone Wars animated series, he felt a lot more nuanced, just because it's kind of funny that in a kid's show, an animated show, is when you find more emotional nuance for a character so complex as Anakin as he becomes Darth Vader. And speaking of TV shows, we have The Mandalorian, which reintroduced Boba Fett in its second season. So I'm going to toss this out to all of you. What did you feel? Like, how did you think about that? But at the same time, did you feel that Boba Fett needed to return once again to the Star Wars universe? And then consequently, did he need his own show as sort of a spin-off of The Mandalorian? So Diane, we'll start with you.
I was all in. I was completely stoked. I was just like, yes. Because I thought that, The Mandalorian, it had become clear that he was kind of becoming like sort of, soft on one side because he has the attachment to Grogu. And so I kind of missed, somebody who just wasn't as attached to anybody. And having Boba back was great for that, but also because I hated what happened to him in Return of the Jedi. I hated it. It didn't make me laugh at all. I was furious. And I think that was the one thing about the original trilogy, one of the things that I just never quite was like, really? Like, I get you need him to not be a problem anymore, but that was stupid. And even like 10-year-old me watching that was like, that was dumb. Why'd you do that? And so much more could have been done. And I was frustrated with that. So when he came back, I was like, oh, thank God, like here's a whole new opportunity to rethink this. And, he'd already been brought back in a way in the prequels, for his origin. I thought, because there was so much potential there. And I was just tickled that we finally had that ability to do that. And he's introduced, to come and kick some ass with Din, and I was tickled to death. I was so happy. And then when I found out there was going to be a show, I was like, yes. I mean, it's just like, here is the opportunity to see in live action that seedy underbelly of this glitzy galaxy that sometimes has been a little dusty around the edges, but like I wanted more grit. I wanted to dig into that. And so I got what I wanted, and I just didn't get as much as I wanted.
Right.
And so we can talk about that swerve later.
Well, almost 40 years later, after the Return of the Jedi comes out, Boba kind of kind of gets his redemption. But
Right.
we'll dig into that after.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah. And Gareth, what about you? How did you feel seeing him in The Mandalorian? And did you feel he needed to return or deserve his own show?
I really loved The Mandalorian. So when he showed up, I was just like, okay, I retract my earlier objections to them doing a Boba Fett show because, just seeing him in The Mandalorian was, oh yeah, okay, this is good. So from that point in, I was totally all in on it. And to be honest, the Book of Boba Fett, I think, is just a kind of another series of The Mandalorian in a lot of ways. Because they started the story in The Mandalorian, and then the Mandalorian story is continuing in the Book of Boba Fett. So to be honest, they're so interlinked at this point, I don't think you can pick them apart. But yeah, I mean, whether he needed to come back is another matter. I think he needed more justice than he got by just being yeeted into a Sarlacc pit. Because this is the guy in the second film. He's the only one who actually sasses Vader. Everyone else is terrified of Vader, and Vader's there going, no disintegrations. And he's just like, yeah, whatever, dude.
Zero chill.
Yeah, but also that implies that he has done lots of disintegrations. Yeah. And he's just, you can tell that he doesn't give a damn about Vader. He doesn't care. Vader's just, paying him. So he's like the only character there that doesn't give a crap about the Empire. He's just like, he's just there for the money, and he keeps going, well, who's going to pay me if Solo doesn't survive the process? And Vader's going, yeah, you'll get some money. Now just back off. So someone with those that kind of sort of presence and balls, just in the opening of the third film, just get a comedy pratfall into a Sarlacc pit, followed by the Sarlacc burping, just to...
I know.
That was just that was not good. So he
I
deserved
didn't even
the
remember
justice
the
of coming
burping
back.
part.
Yeah,
that just makes
I
it all
don't know
even
if they
seem
added
like
that in the special edition or not.
That's possible, just to enhance the comedic effect. Like it didn't need to be a comedic death. Could have been cool.
Yeah, it could have been cool.
I can't remember if they used the Wilhelm scream on him or not, but it was.
They definitely did. They definitely did. Yeah.
But
I had to explain to my wife recently the Wilhelm scream.
I think having him come back, and I can understand why some people are expecting him to come back as this badass bounty hunter, but we've kind of got that in The Mandalorian already. So seeing him come back as an older version, wiser, who's spent some time in the middle of a Sarlacc and climbs out, you can tell why he's just done with all that, and he's just like, no, I want to make the decisions now. So I think bringing him back has given an opportunity to tell a whole different story about him that maybe we weren't expecting, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. And Jenny, I'll get your opinion on this as well, in terms of Boba returning in The Mandalorian and whether he needed his own show or needed to come back at all.
Yeah, so it's kind of follows suits with my rest of my thoughts on him, in that it was just kind of like, sure, you're going to give me more Star Wars content, I'm going to watch more Star Wars content. Like, it doesn't matter what it is. But I remember my initial reaction, I try not to keep up on a lot of like what they're planning on doing, or I'm the kind of person that doesn't watch trailers unless I have to or they're forced in front of me. I just don't want my expectations set a certain way, because I think that's where a lot of the where people get like overly negative online. It's like, well, I expected this and I didn't get it. And it's like, well, it's you're not watched a trailer and you interpreted it one way and it wasn't that way and whatever. So I try to avoid all of that just for that sole purpose. So I think I had heard prior to the end of The Mandalorian that there was going to be one, but I hadn't really thought about it. And my biggest concern at that moment was, but The Mandalorian's continuing, right? Because like at the end of that, it was not clear at all. They were just like Boba Fett. And I was like, we're not just like making this into a Boba Fett show now, correct? Because I'm super obsessed with The Mandalorian. Like really obsessed with it. So my main concern was if Boba Fett is taking over Mandalorian, I'm going to be very mad. Um, that's not what happened, obviously. So we're all good there. But I remember talking to my friends about it. One of my best friends has always been one of those, like, loves Boba Fett, like, thought he was the coolest character all the time, dying to have more of him. And he was like, oh no, they'll screw it up. They're gonna do something stupid. Like, how do they even do that? Like, I was like, that's a good point. It'll be interesting to see. So I was definitely interested to see what they did with it. I loved Fennec Shand, so knowing she was involved, I was like, yep, let's see how that goes. Whether or not he, again, needs his own show, maybe not, but I'm also fine with taking those. I think it's a good approach from a economic standpoint and a fan building standpoint for them to find these pieces that people universally have glommed onto and expand on them so that they can keep getting more people into it, so that the next time, if they do want to make a new person that we haven't seen before, a story about them, we're already super invested in it as a whole. So maybe more people will come forward to watch it. So I'm fine with, doing those kind of, I don't want to call it fan service, but kind of fan servicey things.
Right.
If it means getting more people interested in Star Wars and therefore making more Star Wars content. Because again, that's all I really want.
I agree. And on top of that, back to something Gareth mentioned, they kind of just piggyback this off of the Mandalorian success, and this is like faux season 3 for that show.
Right.
And so I feel the Mandalorian's representation of sort of like Mandalorian culture and the armor, I think just like the iconography of the armor in and of itself is enough to have this association between Din Djarin and Boba Fett, such that people are like, oh man, I'm really aching for a new season of The Mandalorian. I want to see more Grogu. And it's like, well, here it is. It's just wrapped up in a little Boba Fett package. Enjoy. So I think that was really smart. And I want to put it out to all of you what your first impressions of the show were and how you thought the two main characters, from my perspective, are Boba Fett and Fennec Shand. How you thought Tamara Morrison and Fennec Shand was by Ming-Na Wen. How you felt they were portrayed and how they kind of carried the show. So Diane, we'll start with you.
Oh, I love them both just unapologetically, and I love the interesting chemistry they have together. It's kind of unique in the Star Wars universe. What they have is, two very, agent, they're free agents essentially, right? Use a baseball term, and they're doing their own thing, but they've come together and it works. Like when Fennec ultimately decides, I'm going to stick around for see what happens, kind of thing. I was like, I hope they always stick around as a team, because I think they make a dynamic duo. I think that, they're both killing machines, but they're nuanced people. And that's what we saw a lot of that development with Boba, particularly, being around the Tuscan Raiders and learning their culture and giving Tamara an opportunity to put some of his own indigenous Maori aspect into it, which I just adored.
Yeah,
and I thought was possibly the best aspect of all of it. But also just Fennec, Fennec's a complete badass. Like she's jumped in my ranking of all Star Wars characters as being probably in the top 5 now, because I think she's amazing, and she doesn't have anything to do with the Force. And that's one thing I like about both of them, actually, is that they don't care. Just like Boba didn't give a crap about Vader and the Empire, he also really kind of doesn't care about the Jedi either, and Fennec doesn't either. They're just like, look, we get the job done, period. And then, at the end of the season, when, they're kind of talking about like, is this really for us or not? And I like that they're just basically writing their own destiny in real time and deciding and making the choice like, well, it's better than getting killed, like living a gritty life out on the edge, is what they're good at. And so they're going to keep doing that. And I like the team. And I thought both actors were great. I love the sort of laid back, chill vibe of both of them. They're not into melodrama. They're into getting the thing done, whatever that is.
Yeah, I like what you brought up there. It's like they're flying by the seam of their pants, essentially, or their
Yeah,
suits, whatever they're wearing. And a lot of the times during the show, they're just kind of like, well, this is what we're faced with. Oh, fuck it. Let's like do this.
I know.
Cause sure, they're flying by gut feeling and instinct most of the time,
Right.
which is something that you don't necessarily see a lot of in the Star Wars universe, because the Force is,
Exactly.
of course, it's instinctual, but it feels a lot more calculated. Whereas this feels a
Right.
lot more just like raw and I
Yeah,
don't know,
they feel like
like
one of us in that regard, right? They're like
yeah,
they're not at all supernaturally, imposed upon by anything other than surviving.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
they're figuring out a morality that fits within that frame. Whereas maybe in their past, not so much, but now they're kind of like, wait a minute, people are getting wronged. I'm not okay with that,
Mhm.
so, but they're not sacrificing, not becoming goody two shoes either. I love that sweet spot, the sort of gray area they're walking through.
And it's cool because I think it's questioned multiple times during this show, but was one of my favorite aspects is the flexibility of moral uh sort of like moral approaches to everything that's going around. It's like there's moral flexibility here. It doesn't necessarily have to be so
Right.
black and white. It doesn't mean like Boba used to be a ruthless bounty hunter, that he can't
Yeah.
evolve as a human being and sort of
Yeah,
develop empathy through the Tuscan Raiders of all people.
I know,
Yeah.
which was
Well,
awesome.
yeah, we'll get a little bit more into that, but
All
Gareth,
right.
first, your first impressions and then how you thought of Boba and Fennec.
Sorry, me. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, my first impressions were really good from obviously the Mandalorian, when he appeared in the Mandalorian. Him and Fennec immediately, very iconic double act. Um, but I really like the scenario that they've created there. It's kind of as Diane was saying, the Empire has fallen, the war is over, and you've got all these characters wandering around, sort of basically sort of like Ronan, that they're warriors without masters anymore, and they're trying to find their own way. You've
Mhm.
got the Wookiee, whose name I won't even attempt to pronounce, and
Chrysanthemum.
yeah, um, and you've got all these sort of hired guns that are now wandering around trying to find a place for themselves in the universe. And I like that Boba has kind of gone back to his former employer and Jabba the Hutt's palace and go, right, okay, I know how this works. I'm going to have some of this. And you've got these other characters sort of wandering through. You've got the sheriff as well, and there's all these sort of fascinating characters who are just trying to build lives in the ruins of the Empire, while the New Republic is confined to acting like traffic cops. Really, they're sort of flying around in X-wings, pulling people up for speeding or smuggling, but they're not down on the ground. You never see any New Republic troops on the ground in Tatooine. They're obviously not large enough to enforce that law. So you have the characters like the Fett and the syndicates enforcing, basically enforcing the laws themselves. And I think that's a much more fascinating milieu than we had with the Skywalker saga, where there's light and dark, and it's very binary, and there's very little
Yeah.
shade in between. And you got Han Solo in there, but there's very little on either side. So I think this is the Book of Boba Fett and the Mandalorian are exactly what I wanted Star Wars to be when I was like 10 years old, because it was the stuff that you're looking at the wretched hive of scum and villainy. That's what we wanted to see more of. We wanted to explore Mos Eisley and hang out in those bars and things. So yeah, this is exactly what I always wanted from Star Wars.
There's a video game that was being made that got canceled called Star Wars 1313, and that is basically what Mandalorian and Boba Fett filled the void of this game that was supposed to be following a bounty hunter. I'm pretty sure Boba Fett was meant to appear in it, and in the lower depths of Coruscant's levels. So the lower you go, the seedier and
Mhm.
grimier and more criminally oriented it became. And I was like, that's what I want from Star Wars. It's like I've seen all the, Diane, you brought up the glossiness of Star Wars. It's like just to be crude, it's like I want to see the shit
Right.
of the Star Wars galaxy. I want to see, like,
Sewers.
just like I want to see like the filth, and I want it to just
Cesspits.
to have more nuance there as opposed to
And to feel that danger.
exactly.
Of course, ain't gonna save you down there. You know what I mean?
There's no Jedi down there. Like,
right.
Nobody's gonna pull with a lightsaber.
Yeah.
And Gareth, what about Boba Fett and Fennec Shand? How did they come across to you in terms of their acting and everything?
Well, I mean, they're both incredibly watchable actors, and he has great gravitas when he wants to, especially in the scenes with the Tuscan Raiders when he's going, he's suffering, he's going through stuff, but then you can see him kind of without ever saying it, you can see his sympathies changing, and you can see the cogs turning in his mind. When he sees the biker gang attacking that farmer. And you can see things changing for him. So when he decides to become, the criminal boss, you kind of understand. You've seen that change. I've just crawled out of a sarlacc. I've seen a load of bad stuff, and I've seen what it means to be respected. And now I kind of want that. So yeah, I really like the new iteration of Fett, the sort of older and wiser warrior who's trying to think outside the box instead of doing what he's always done.
Mm-hmm. And he's a crime boss, yes, and he assumes that mantle, but you can tell his journey, and especially his time with the Tuscan Raiders, gave him the perspective to approach the title of crime boss, daimyo, however you want to call it in this certain case. He's approaching it with a more empathy, which is strange for someone who's originally portrayed as so, I guess, like one note and a bit more morally corrupt. So it was really nice to see that expansion of his moral compass and his character.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of westerns, and this is very much in the Western tradition of films such as Tombstone, where the main characters, who are all sort of become lawmen, but they all have very, very, very shady pasts, and it's that kind of reinventing yourself, and the gunslinger who wants to put away his guns, but he's always being challenged from Shane and stuff like that. So there's a lot of that in there, and that's really awesome.
Yeah, and also this kind of ties back into the history of the Star Wars universe itself, where George Lucas was directly influenced from Western films, but also the work of Akira Kurosawa. And Gareth, you mentioned Ronin before. This is actually really cool because it's like the Empire is in shambles, and all these different power players kind of assume the role of samurais without masters, and so they become Lone Rangers and go off and try to figure out their place in this whole mess, and try to create something, whether it's good or bad, whether their intentions are good or bad, or a little bit more nuanced, I think is exactly what Star Wars needs right now. It just needs more complexity and more empathy to go along with all the moral conundrums that it's presenting. And Jenny, I'll toss it to you what your first impressions of the show were, and then what you thought of Boba and Fennec Shand.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with a lot of what you guys are saying. To preface, I love Star Wars, as I have made clear, and that is why I'm so critical of it. So I'm a little, I don't know. I don't want to say disappointed because I didn't really have a lot of expectations, but I felt like there were a lot of things that could have been done a lot better, and I think it suffered a bit, mostly from pacing and structure. And by a bit, I mean a lot. And I think a lot of that goes down to, character arcs, for me personally, character arcs and a plot arc. And I couldn't really connect with either very strongly, despite really wanting to. And I struggled with that a lot in the first. And I think a lot of things came together well. And like Gareth, you were mentioning, coming from the lone wolf sort of aspect too. And that's something I was thinking about a lot in the last episode, especially because it's really about this like community coming together to fight for what they want. But prior to that, I hadn't really seen a before for Boba Fett. He climbs out of the Sarlacc pit, he goes and lives with the Tuscan Raiders, and he's just kind of this like pretty nice, good doing guy the whole show. Shand gives him some teeth occasionally and is like, hey, you probably should be tougher about these things. But for the most part, he's pretty, you know what I mean? He's pretty, or how I perceived him was just that he was pretty, he wanted to do the right thing the whole time. And then he sort of found a way to do the right thing. But I didn't really see the kind of change that I wanted to see. And I think that is because I didn't really see the before from him that I wanted to see. And I don't even know how they would have done that because of how just the circumstances of his death. They would have almost had to bring him out and have him try to return to his old ways first, or show us some kind of, something that happened before, or I don't know. But I think, like we were saying, he's kind of a blank slate character for people where they can fill that role. So if you were like me, where you didn't insert yourself into that character and come up with headcanon of how badass and lone wolfy he was, then you never saw that, you never experienced that before image, you know what I mean? So I think that was one of my like main takeaways from it. And I struggled a little bit with the plot as well, because the overall situation was clear and, maybe a little formulaic at times, but whatever, it's Star Wars, I don't care. But what I was missing was just the economy of it. I didn't understand, and I still don't understand what they were doing. Like, there was a syndicate selling drugs, boohoo, but if you take those drugs off of Tatooine, what are they producing? Like, what do they make on that planet? Like, I don't know that they have an economy if they're not supporting shady dealings. And so I just I got lost in a lot of that, whereas it's like I'm trying to sympathize with either the characters or the plot and understand the goals, but I could never really grasp on to any of that. But the rest of it, like, the production value was great. The actors did an amazing job. Like, the effects were great. All of that was great. But the pacing and structure, and as the Mandalorian episode in the middle of it, like, I'm not going to complain, because as stated previously, I loved the Mandalorian. I was like, cool, we're getting a Mando episode. Let's do it. But it felt almost like a reverse backdoor pilot. Like, they were like struggling to like with the other show, so they were like, let's bring the more popular show in to get people on board, but they had already had episode. I don't know, it felt really strange to me.
It was strange
overall. Yeah. And again, fine with it, because Mando's so awesome. But it was distracting to me, because I love him and his character and that relationship between him and Grogu so much that I don't care about anything else that's happening once they're on screen. So it was honestly, I would have rather them given Boba his whole first season on his own to do his own thing, and then next season bring Mando in and tie the two together and have it be this awesome crossover we can really, dig into.
Exactly. That was my problem with it too.
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head. Like, pacing for me was the biggest issue, and we'll dig a little bit into a lot into the narrative, which I've kind of boiled down into three main strands. So we have Boba, and I kind of want to get Diane's opinion on this. His escape from the Sarlacc pit, which was very funny because I think Patton Oswalt, the comedian and actor,
he basically nailed that whole scenario. Like, and whether they took it from him or not, I don't know.
I think they did. They must have. But that was really cool
too, because he's technically part of the whole Disney pantheon. So I think they totally got it from him.
He's Ratatouille. Come on. And so we have that thread with Boba's escape from the Sarlacc pit, his time with the Tuscan Raiders, and sort of his more empathetic turn, whether it was successful or not, like Jenny was mentioning. And then we have the current narrative with Fennec Shand and Boba as they sort of assume the mantle of these criminal enterprise in the shadow of Jabba the Hutt and Bib Fortuna, and sort of their clash with the Pike Syndicate and all this kind of stuff. And then we have the just straight up beeline over to the Mandalorian and figure out what's going on there, and his time with Grogu. And then we also have the return of Luke Skywalker and Ahsoka Tano. So first we'll get into his flashback times in Diane, what's your take on the Sarlacc pit and how he escaped? And can Mandalorian armor, obviously it can survive the acid saliva of a Sarlacc pit, but can the cracks between the armor survive? Like, I don't know about that.
That's funny. Like, this isn't the first time that I've gotten a discussion about Beskar, because I brought up on Twitter, like, okay, can Beskar resist xenomorph acid blood from Alien? Yes or no? And the response was hilarious to me. And I think that I forget what I said. Like, I said something like, "This is not the way," or affirmative. It's your choices, right? So, it's totally whole hog nerditry, two different franchises.
Yeah.
And I think that the resistance of Beskar is according to plot so far, because one thing that I love is that there's still a lot of Mandalore lore that we don't know. We know a lot from Clone Wars, which was very interesting, but there's a lot of this nuance to everything, and the armorer, who's fascinating and quite terrifying in her own right. And honestly, I'm not entirely convinced she's good, but that's a whole nother subject. That's one reason I like her, is because I don't know yet, right? She's become now what Boba was in the past, in a way, for this
intrigue of
TV
mystery
pantheon. Yeah, but she has this interesting code, right? Which is the Mandalorian Code, and a lot of this, Beskar being basically a holy, very nearly holy, item. It's almost like, if you've read his Dark Materials or seen the show, it's almost like your demon, your soul, in a way, is the Beskar in your armor.
Mm-hmm.
If you sacrifice any of that, then that's a problem. In terms of its resistance and having cracks in it, I don't know the answer to that. And I'm not sure I needed to know, because, I was just happy that, first of all, Boba survived and that he found a way to get out. Sometimes you have to look, I come from a background of science. And of course I was thinking, and I had to remove my brain from that line of thinking, well, could that really work? Could the digestive juices of the Sarlacc? But then again, it takes a long time to digest. So maybe the acid's not that powerful after all. If it takes thousands of years to digest anything, maybe it's just a weak ass acid.
Yeah.
So I have to just kind of let that shit go, because this is Star Wars, and I'm not in Star Wars for the science of science fiction. I'm in it because it's a grand story with a broad, landscape and canvas to work with. And, we pull a little bit from science, but a lot of times it's space fantasy.
Exactly.
And I'm cool with that. I'm absolutely cool with that. It's not supposed to be 2001, And so I didn't have a problem with that whole aspect, because, again, it's Star Wars, and it's Star Wars has always been pulpy, and in pulp, productions, sometimes people come back from the dead. God knows it's rampant in comic books, and I'm a big comic book fan. I'm cool with that too. I really liked seeing the Patton Oswalt universe come crashing through the Tatooine soil. And I'm just glad he got out. I was actually more intrigued by the scene in which he's taking his ship and dipping down over the mouth of it after he's out, right? And I actually really loved that scene.
Yeah,
it had a true jump scare, and I was like, oh, this is fun, because I never would have thought about doing that. And, it wasn't a perfect scene. There were some logistical things that were like, well, I don't know about that. But I kind of still dug it just because it was unique. And, I don't know. It was just like him feeling like he had to go back there, first of all, and what he needed to do. There were some plot holes with that where, like, they could have sent a little camera droid, one of the little things down in, but I was like, that wouldn't have been as cool. And you got to go for cool. It's Star Wars. It's got to be cool. So,
no, that's exactly it. Like with Star Wars, it's like spectacle begets science every time. And if
and emotion too, right? Because, you want to, you feel a certain way in Star Wars. You don't go into it thinking you're going to learn about physics and biology. You can draw from those things, and I love when they do it. And I love also, coming as an ecology background, seeing the different species of Tatooine and how they interact with that environment, and how they cope with having twin sons and all. It's a whole other subject I could talk for hours about, but I was totally fine with how it happened. I was like, I'm just glad he's back. This is groovy. Let's just go.
Yeah, it's like, fuck it. It's Star Wars. There's space wizards and magic, and it's all good.
I know.
Yeah, I think Jenny,
Forget.
you and I had you brought that up during our recent space opera episode about how it's like, yeah, Star Wars is full on space fantasy. It doesn't even
Yeah.
Yeah,
fit.
definitely. Yeah, which
It
is
doesn't
fine.
even.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like that's what it is, and that's cool.
Yeah.
And Gareth, I want to get your take on the time with the Tuscan Raiders. Diane, you brought up earlier how Tamara Morrison was able to sort of bring in his own indigenous background and have
Right.
that reflected there. And for me, this is one of my favorite parts of the show was just like the humanity
Same.
that was given to the Tuscan Raiders. I love because before this, they were just a bunch of like, like
Feral.
savages.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Gareth, what's your take on the Tuscan Raiders and his time with them?
I can see why they had to do all that in flashback, because we had already seen in The Mandalorian him reclaiming his armor, which is obviously one of his most important kind of goals. So they kind of had to do that in flashback, but it did it did upset the pacing a bit, having to do these massive flashbacks and then come back to, oh yeah, this is going on, and it kind of, I think it detracted from both stories. I would have liked it more chronologically, but as I said, they'd already shown in The Mandalorian him getting his armor back, so maybe that would have not worked quite so well. But I think his time with the Tuscan Raiders, as I touched on earlier, it's all about the character development and him becoming more kind of going from a sort of lone wolf with his own code to finding this other code and developing sympathy for people who are essentially getting to use a Roman expression, the shitty end of the stick, because they were the original inhabitants of Tatooine, and they've had to adapt to living in the desert after all the water's gone away, and they're getting shot at by passing trains, and they're getting harassed by biker gangs, and all of this. So you start to understand that maybe the reason they sit around taking pot shots at pod racers is because they've got some legitimate grievances.
They're just pissed off.
Yeah. I think the show was in some ways walking a fine line between giving them their own culture and maybe not parodying, but kind of erring into kind of Native American movie tropes, sort of like Dances with Wolves and so on, of the kind of the outsider who goes into and proves himself as one of the tribe and is inducted into the tribe. Also, so I was watching those scenes slightly uncomfortably, thinking, oh dear, this could get quite racist quite quickly if we're not careful. And I mean, to be honest, Star Wars has previous for that, especially in the prequel films. So I was kind of watching that a little bit out the corner of my eye, thinking, but I think they got away with it, and they managed to make the Tuscans the same as the Mandalorians. There are huge parallels between the way that the tribe seemed organized and the way the Mandalorian with the armor and seemed organized as well. So there was obviously a lot of crossover there. So you could see why there was some sympathy between the parties. So I think it was definitely an interesting option for how to change him as a person.
Yeah, and Jenny, you brought up sort of the believability of his moral transition, his sort of waking up, and it didn't entirely work for you. So I'm curious, from your perspective, did the death of the Tuscan Raiders and how that all ties into the storyline and how his relationship with the tribe developed, was that a believable motive for you in terms of Boba's moral shift, or what worked and what didn't?
Yeah, so I definitely think that the setup as far as like having him live with them and learn from them and having that inform that change is great. I loved that. That was some of my favorite stuff in the show. I do, again, like Gareth was mentioning, I wished it would have been structured differently, maybe. Like, maybe at the beginning of the first episode, they could have done some setup and then just flashback and stayed flashback until they were done. I also think it was just a little too long. Like, they could have shortened that and spent more time after the fact showing, because we really just gloss over the whole him taking the palace and starting to build that up. Like, we don't see any of that really. Like, it's very short. So I would have rather like spread it out a little more evenly across that, and I think that would have helped too. There were also just some things that, like I had mentioned, we didn't really get to see the before in the context of this show. We have an idea of what he was before based on what we saw in the previous movies, but again, he's a pretty side character. We don't really get to know him as a person at all. We just have these assumptions that we made about him. So being able to see that before somehow would have been good, or having him struggle more with that while he first lives with the Raiders, I think would have been good. And then just seeing how he takes what he learned from the Raiders and translating that into actionable goals. He kind of just is like, oh, there's an empty palace that Shand and I can take easily. Let's do that. And it just seems sort of like the thing he was going to go do, and that it wasn't really like an impetus of any kind of action necessarily. I mean, I guess he wanted to get revenge on whatever the train situation thing was.
Yeah.
Which is a whole other thing as far as introducing the bad guys too late in the show, and we can talk about that later maybe. But yeah, I think that was kind of my main issue, is just that there didn't seem to be an arc, and even to the end, he kind of just acted the same. Like, I felt like he was acting the same pretty much the entire time. Like, he was reasonable. He stuck up for the little guy, almost right away when he's with the Tuscan Raiders. He's sticking up for that little kid and saving people and doing the right thing. And that's great. I love a character that does that, but there was just no easing into it, I guess, and no struggling with that moral question, or, he just didn't feel like the sort of solitary lone wolf, morally questionable person at the beginning enough for me to kind of buy that change into being all about community by the end, which I think would have been really good. And I think there are definitely some ways that they could have done that a little better. I don't think they failed entirely. It just didn't 100% work for me.
Yeah, I'm on a similar page in terms of, I like the intention of them wanting to create this moral shift. I think it would have been so cool. I just thought of this while you were talking. If, in order to show how brutal Boba was before, we had a ton of flashbacks and even some flashbacks to his time on Camino. There could have been this really cool montage of him just killing people as a bounty hunter. And that would have been enough for me to sort of balance my perspective of Boba as this brutal person. And then him to, like you say, with his time with the Tuscan Raiders, sort of contemplate what he'd done in the past.
Yeah,
and
wait a minute. I'm not okay with that.
And think about how could I sort of move past my darker shade of my darker history and into something more fruitful in terms of community, or in terms of a relationship, or friendships and stuff like that. Diane, go for it.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, that brings up a point, because it's pretty dang late in the show that, he gets called out as being a killer, you're always going to be a killer, and I'm like, well, not really, yes, when you have to, but I think that would have been good. And so this is one reason the whole narrative structure of, Deus Ex Mandalorian coming in, crash landing into the plot and swerving away like it was part of Life of Brian with the UFO scene. But, it was kind of like, what the fuck? Anyway, so I had a problem with that, because I thought that if they hadn't brought, season 2.5-ish of Mandalorian in, if they had a longer arc with just Boba, we could have had what you were talking about. We could have seen some of that background. We could have had a lot more going on that would have made logical sense, and we would have seen him break good. in a better narrative way. But I don't know who decided that was like, no, we're just going to make this Mandalorian, next season we're going to throw Luke in there too. Why not? And I'm like, oh, okay. But we could have had that. And that was one reason I was frustrated. Like, don't get me wrong. I love Luke and I love Grogu and I love the Mandalorian and I love Ahsoka. But
I could have waited.
I could have waited. I wanted to wait. I was not prepared for that. And I knew the second it happened that it would just hijack the entire development of Boba and nobody would give a shit anymore.
Yeah.
So, and I just had a real problem with that because there was so much potential to talk about Boba and I wanted to know more about Boba and about Shan, So.
No,
Another way to do
agree.
that. Oh.
Go ahead, Jenny.
Another way that they could have done that too, and what I thought at first, or what I was hoping that they were doing when they broke to Mando, was having a time jump. So when we returned to Boba, he would have built up his army or whatever and gotten things set up for this potential attack. But then we just go back and it's like right away. It's like the same exact time. So like no time had passed. So that might have helped, but they would have had to still, I think, add at least an episode or two to the season length.
Yeah.
But that's fine. It's like the show was only 7 episodes. It could have been 8.
Right.
And they could have
easily done 8.
They could have fixed a lot of the pacing issues by getting rid of the Mandalorian stuff. They could have had like really cool teases in there to sort of entice people. Like this is what's coming.
That would have been awesome.
Yeah.
But not the complete sideline that happened, because that for me, like you, Jenny, and Diane, I'm sure Gareth as well, it's just kind of like it was cool, but it took me out of it. And then I cared more about the Mandalorian and Grogu than I did about Boba Fett. And I think they could have done, like, instead of flashbacks, it would have been effective to have, just from the beginning, like Jenny, you mentioned, like have his time with the Tuscan Raiders lead naturally into the totally glossed over murder of Bib Fortuna, which is another time he just murders someone, even though Bib Fortuna is a piece of shit. But they kind of made that too simplistic, and it's like him and Fennec Shan is like, cool, we just sneak into the kitchen and we like grapple with some droids, and there's this cheesy chase scene, and then all of a sudden we have the whole castle, like it's ours now. It's like cool. All right. And it just it didn't feel like it was fleshed out enough, and the pacing throughout the whole season suffered because of that. And so we can get into the present day stuff where Boba and Fennec are accumulating their sort of goodwill within the community, their power, what have you, and battling it out against the Pike Syndicate. And there are some interesting things that happen here, like the Hutt twins. I think were really funny and kind of showed a bit more of a dynamic to the Hutt clan.
That was cool.
Yeah, and they also brought up this one thing that I thought was so poignant, because it kind of encapsulates so much of the Star Wars universe and this obsession with Tatooine and this shitty rock of a planet. One of the Hutt twins straight up says, like, why are so many people attached to this like useless hunk of rock? And I thought about it and I'm like, yeah, why? Like, Jenny, you mentioned there's no economy here. Like, what do people do other than just like scrounge by?
I can make statements about certain parts of this country that I wonder why they exist and why people even live there, but people do. And, and that in and of itself is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So does anyone want to jump in on the sort of current timeline and Boba and Fennec as they wrangle their power? And then we can bring up other things like the super, super cheesy mod biker gang, whatever you want to call them, as well as Chrysanthemum and
lowriders.
Other things. Yeah, a friend of mine called them the Power Rangers because they all have like distinct, colorful bicycles.
I thought them as like the lowrider, and I thought that was kind of cool in a way. And I could see them getting all beaten up and kind of scuffy, but they still try to keep them preserved, and it's an entire culture in and of itself. I was okay with that. I didn't have a problem with that.
Yeah, but I think it was just a little bit cheesy. There are a lot of things about the mod biker gang that was like, oh, come on.
It was even kind of like a Doctor Who.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, like I was okay with it, but there was just no logic behind, like, where did these people who are supposedly too poor to buy water getting these bikes from? Like, there was just a lot of that kind of thing going on with it that threw me off.
And then that also kind of plays into just Tatooine, and it's like everyone's scrounging by. So how does anyone other than a criminal find, or drug dealers like a syndicate find success here? You know?
Yeah.
And then what does that say about the Star Wars obsession with like one planet, one biome as well? It's like,
Yeah.
oh my god. Anyone want to jump in on
Yeah.
that and just have comments about whatever about this current
that is
timeline?
pretty typical. That is
Yeah.
pretty typical of Star Wars, where you have like, I mean, Naboo, you know, being sort of pockmarked within with lots of water sources like that. And I'm like, they kind of make it a whole thing, but at the same time, some of it is just a little too convenient or whatever, you
Yeah.
know? There isn't much subtlety in the ecology of Star Wars.
No, not at all.
It's not Arrakis,
No.
you know?
But then without that, we wouldn't have gotten that amazing deep sea submersible scene with Obi-Wan and
Oh, I know.
Qui-Gon Jinn.
With the giant sort of anglerfish
Yeah,
beasties, you know, which were
exactly.
cool. And you know, that's fun, and I dip into that myself. You're like, you go to a planet which is known for a certain thing, and that might be how it kind of ends up being. That, you know, like,
Yeah.
that's the desert planet, and that's the forest moon, and you know, that's the way it is. That's what it's known for. But you know, if you don't have a whole lot of time to dig into the ecology of it, I'm okay with that.
That's just the
It's fun.
ecology and physics of the Star Wars universe. Doesn't make
Yeah.
sense, but it works.
Yeah.
And we can. I mean, there's not too much to say about the present timeline because it ties into the Mandalorian and how all of that converges in the finale. So let's get into that Mandalorian sideline of Din Djarin. I love my wife is obsessed with it, but the little chainmail, the Beskar chainmail that
The mithril coat.
Yeah.
so fucking cool.
So cute.
And how Din Djarin essentially has his quarrels with the Mandalorians and his possession of the Darksaber, and then leading into Grogu's training session with Luke Skywalker. So Gareth, you haven't said anything in a little bit. Do you want to get in on that?
Again, I thought it was, you know, I really enjoyed those bits. I love Ahsoka. Seeing her and Luke actually interacting for the first time was just amazing. But again, it's Mandalorian continuity, not Boba Fett continuity. It seemed kind of plonked into the story, which was already a complicated story because it's being told in flashbacks and so forth. And while the sort of, I think that might be one of the reasons why the final episode felt so rushed. The final confrontation felt so rushed was because he'd been running around collecting these people that were going to help him in the final shootout, kind of Magnificent Seven style. But then we just veered away from that for 2 episodes, really, and then sort of came back. And I don't think we had time for the Pike Syndicate to really be set up as anything more than just these faceless dudes who come down and cause trouble and need to be dealt with. They spent more time setting up the 2 Hutt twins as villains, and then they just went, oh, you know what? We're just going to go. Bye. Have a Rancor.
And here's a baby Rancor as well.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it was, you know, I don't think we've seen enough of the Syndicate, and I expected at the end a reveal about who was behind the Syndicate. You know, expected it to be sort of Han Solo's ex-girlfriend from the Solo movie or somebody like that.
That would have been awesome. I wanted that too. Yeah. Kira.
And to kind of set that up as a kind of, you know, rather than just this faceless syndicate who all, you know, dress alike and come and, you know, stand around in the desert with chests full of spices when, you know, why weren't they doing their business at Mos Eisley if they're that powerful? I didn't understand. But anywho, yeah, I mean, this isn't The Sopranos, so the timeline. I felt it was only the whole veering away into the Mandalore. Well, that was in some ways the best bit, and that Mandalore episode is one of the best bits of Star Wars I've ever seen. I mean, just cinematically, the kind of the Imperial droids and the probe droids marching through the fire like something from Terminator Judgment Day. All of that kind of got the history of Mandalore just encapsulated in a few images. I mean, it was a fantastic, fantastic episode. But it just kind of the kind of build up towards Boba's confrontation with the mayor and with the Pike Syndicate kind of just squealed to a stop. And I thought that was a shame. I thought, as Jen said earlier, the pacing on all of this has been very uneven. But I don't want to sound too negative because I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed all of it. You know, and I just viewing it as a whole with the Mandalorian as well. It's all just one show as far as I'm concerned. So I really loved it. But yeah, the pacing was a little uneven.
Yeah, I'm on the same page as you. For me, it just feels like an extension. You know, season 2.5 essentially.
Yeah.
And there was some like the cinematography and everything in episode 5 and 6 and the way that everything about the Mandalorian and his history and the destruction of Mandalore and all that kind of stuff was super cool. You know, there's the ring world that he goes and visits, which was awesome. And at the same time, it was like the first instance where I can really distinctly remember like clear public transport in the Star Wars universe. And him having to pack away all of his stuff into like a safe box, and it's like you can't get on unless you pack your guns and stuff away.
I know, so
and
relatable.
I thought that was so cool. I was like, cool, the public transport exists. Like, not everybody owns a ship. That's really like a nice little touch. And I felt like that attention to detail could have just been applied to another full episode of the Book of Boba Fett, and this kind of stuff, you know, as I mentioned earlier, just tease it, but don't just drop it in there in this way. Because I felt like they just wanted to throw in too much fan service, especially with Luke and Ahsoka and Grogu. Because the Mandalorian could have easily come into the fold, but not necessarily in such a way where he's like a POV character and taking away 2 whole episodes from Boba Fett. And that, you know, just threw the pacing off completely. And then I asked my wife like what she thought about the season, and the first thing that she came back to was like, oh, I love the Mandalorian and Grogu. And I'm like, well, that's not the fucking point of a Boba Fett TV show. Gareth,
alternatively, they could have done it as season 3 of the Mandalorian and just had the Mandalorian teaming up with Boba Fett for a season to help him establish his empire, and then go off and do something else. So yeah, it's but I think because Boba Fett is such a big name, he had to have his own, you know, they wanted to give him his own title, his own property. So
yeah,
I kind of wonder, I wanted to ask what each of you thought, you know, like in the CW's DC universe, we have what's called the Arrowverse, right? Where you had Arrow, Green Arrow, you had the Flash, you know, Supergirl, Legends of Tomorrow, Black Lightning, all of that. And then they all would come together for like this amazing, you know, big season ending spectacular arc. And I kind of was wanting that when I knew there was going to be an Ahsoka show and I knew there was going to be a Boba Fett show. I thought it would be great if they like had just a 2-parter or something for each series, because that's kind of how they did it in the Arrowverse. Like it was for each show, they had a different showcase, you know, so that the main character of that show was still the main character, but you had their super friends, you know, come in and help fight these big bad situations. And I was hoping they'd kind of go that route, and they may yet. But the way they set it up was just too much of like somebody coming and you know, jumping on the horse and taking it, running off into the sunset, you know, and not really getting enough back to the core, you know, until literally the very end. So I don't know what their intentions are. And part of me wonders is if the narrative choices that they made are because they have other things in the pipeline, like books and products and all this stuff, and that they're kind of boxed in and we don't have access to that data.
Yeah.
So we're just kind of left with like, well, this is the way it has to be. I don't know, but I know what I'd like to see versus what I saw. And, you know, I don't have any control there, but I wish it would happen so that a crossover could happen occasionally, but not take over the entire narrative.
And that could have happened in like Boba Fett season 2 if they gave it enough time.
Because that's what happens with those CW shows is they rarely ever cross over in the first season of each individual show.
Exactly.
They
Exactly.
each get
Given the show,
established.
yeah.
And then once they're established, they start crossing over and doing cool
Yeah.
things. So that's really what I expected them to do
Me too.
all along. And then when it was like, oh, we're getting an entire Mando episode, huh? Okay.
Right. I mean, again, it feels like it's Star Wars. We love Star Wars. We don't want to complain about it, but at the same time, that could have been done better.
Yeah. And the CG of Luke, I think Ahsoka Tano, her makeup and costuming is fantastic. But the CGI on Luke still, to me, just seems like a little bit off. They were smarter this time around in terms of the way that they angled shots in order to sometimes like conceal his face or shift focus to Grogu. But there were just like a ton of instances where they kept him like as stoic as possible in order to not make his lip movements look so weird, but they still ended up looking weird.
Because it's always the lips with that stuff. The lips always look super wrong. So they were smart. You're right. Like they would cut away to Grogu and then Luke would speak, and like that's all fine. I actually think they did a really good job with that. But he was just in the episode way too much. Like they could have accomplished what they accomplished with that little side subplot thing in a quarter of the time that they did easily.
Yeah, but Grogu's his training session or whatever, his progression was very obviously it's Grogu, so it's going to be cute. It's like, oh, he finally learned how to jump. And of course, when he jumps, he's super cute when he does it. And then when he's so tired at the end of his session, he just has to fall asleep on that rock. I'm like, dude, never fall asleep in a pond, please. Like, number one lesson. Did anyone else have any comments about that whole Mandalorian, Jedi, Luke, Grogu tangent? I could only call it a tangent at this point.
It's pretty tangential.
Yeah,
it seemed in the show.
Yeah, I mean, they used Grogu in some way in the finale, so it was kind of like, oh yeah, he's, we're gathering together forces to help Boba, but in some ways it would have been really cool if Ahsoka had come as well.
Oh my god, yeah.
If they'd had a Jedi fighting with a Mandalorian on the same side like that. That would.
We may yet see that.
Yeah, and it's strongly hinted we're going to see more of Bo-Katan and her posse as well. So.
Oh yeah.
She's already been name dropped. So. But yeah, I think it was mostly there was more set up for the next season of the Mandalorian and than for the rest of the season of Boba Fett. So. Who knows? But I'd like to. Yeah. I think.
And Ahsoka was just kind of in there because they know that Ahsoka's got a TV show coming up, so it's like gotta have her in there,
right?
But I agree that with you, Gareth, you brought up earlier how it's like it was nice for Luke and her to meet, and she's like, "I knew your father" and everything like that, and he's like, "I saw your father turn into a fucking villain." So,
yeah, I'd like her to have been a little more suspicious of Luke, like. I knew your dad, all right, and he was a Jedi, and he dressed all in black like that. So, I got my eye on you, matey.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that would have.
What are you capable of?
But I'm really hoping I don't know if we're going to get a season 2 of Boba Fett or not. But with this one was all set up, I think, and tying it into the world. I really would like to see a second season where he's established as the crime boss. And kind of like The Sopranos, he's running the place now, and he'll have challenges and whatnot. But I really want to get it more believable, where he has a court around him and he has an army, and how he's using that to rule in a slightly different way than the Hutts were, and the temptation to fall into the Hutt way of doing things, and how he and I'd really like to see that as a second season. Now we have now he's kind of set up.
Yeah, and that last notion, his army around him, I thought it was kind of funny that the second half of the season, the thrust was Boba building up his army so he could take on this sort of faceless Pike Syndicate enemy that didn't really, I agree with you, Gareth, it didn't really have much weight to it. It was like, this is just the villain for the sake of villainy. They're drug dealers, of course they are. The spice must flow, what have you. And the buildup of the army ended up being like I don't know, less than 10 people. And then only because the people of Freetown came that there was maybe like 25 or so.
Basically a
But
pickup truck.
we'll get into the finale and what. Yeah, exactly. It's like Diane's childhood in the South, just like, all right, we got this pickup truck, everyone's got their shotguns, let's go fuck them up. You know?
Yeah, I'm from a family of moonshiners, and I had ancestors who talked of that very scenario.
Yeah.
So, you know.
But what did everyone think of the final battle, and also the inclusion and reveal of Cad Bane, who, for anyone who I guess hasn't seen the animated shows, they don't really know who Cad Bane is, because I'm pretty sure he only shows up there, but he's one of the most notorious bounty hunters in the Star Wars universe, and he also has a personal relationship with Boba as sort of like a mentor of sorts.
Right.
And so it was really cool to see him, but we'll get into the final battle and then how Cad Bane and Boba Fett's final duel in the very Western style comes to a conclusion. So, Diane, do you want to go?
But yeah, we see the Chekhov's staff from the get-go early in the show. We know that's going to come back around. I was waiting, and sure enough, kaboom. So that was very fitting, you know, kind of into that arc, but with still that sort of unsettling reminder, you know, like, you're still a killer, you know, like he still gets that last word in on Boba, which can kind of mess with his head a bit. But, you know, Boba's like, well, yeah, I am. Clink, you know. So I kind of, that was awesome. I loved Rancor Kong.
Yes, that King Kong scene.
It was a hoot. And that was pure Star Wars hoot, you know, like you kind of just have to let the fun happen. So, and I really loved when he showed up on the Rancor, because that was, again, another setup that had to come, that I was wondering when it would happen, and I was hoping it would happen in the finale. So sure enough.
That was also the Chekhov's Rancor.
I know, totally. Yeah. And then we got Thundercat in the end credits again with his, that was awesome. So, and that was kind of a fun swerve too. But I mean, I loved the final showdown. It was a little grueling. Like the droids were just relentless, and not even having the dark saber work very well with him was concerning, because I thought surely that would, you know, take care of them right away, but no. So, but it was also kind of, I mean, they were machines still, right? There wasn't any real personality to that showdown other than Cad Bane. So it's kind of, I kind of was disappointed by that. But again, if I really see an opening, like what Gareth was saying about what you'd like to see in season 2, what I want to see as he establishes his reign, essentially, I want to see Kira show up and mess things up, because she would be an amazing villain for him to have to deal with. And there's a whole lot of opportunity there that could take him off world, or her there, vice versa. And so there's a whole other sort of syndicate out there in the galaxy that, you know, I feel like needs to be tapped into. And this is a perfect opportunity to do it. But so I wanted more of a hint of that in the finale. We didn't quite get it because, you know, it was a big epic showdown, and Mando was there, and Grogu tamed the beast and all that. And, everybody had a nap, you know.
Yeah.
So
and Grogu chose Din Djarin. He's like,
he chose,
I don't want Yoda's lightsaber. Yeah. It's like, I still have like my
some frogs. It's gonna go.
Like, I got my chainmail on underneath my potato sack of an outfit. Like, all right. Yeah. But
it's totally,
The droids, I don't know if anyone got flashbacks to episode 1 and the battle on Naboo with like the bubble shields and all that kind of stuff. I was like, oh man, that's just childhood in a nutshell. You know, all it's missing is there's like those cheeky, stupid droids, the Federation droids, the ones that are like, and they're like comic relief droids, whatever you want to call them.
Which we had some of that going on, But I guess I did. I'll talk briefly about Mando's new ship, which I think is not a practical ship to have as a bounty hunter.
But that was really cool.
We all knew who was going to end up in that dome eventually, the second we saw it. But I did like that callback to that other era that was sleek and shiny and royal, and that, you know, and then I kept hoping that there would be some throwaway line from Luke like, I don't know why it wouldn't make sense, but just that was the fan service in my head. But I was like, I bet that was like what my mom used to have or something like that. So I'm writing this out in my head as I'm watching that ship getting refurbished and watching it on the planet where Luke's at and everything like that. And that was nice and nerdy. I liked it. Still not sure it's real practical for Din to have, but it was fun. It was a nice callback to the prequels, I thought.
And it's like a Formula One car of the Star Wars universe.
Yeah. Flying it down Beggars Canyon through the pod race track, pure fan service all the way. Never mind it hasn't got a trunk, so where's he going to put all the people he catches? But
right.
Just tie them to the outside.
Oh, that brings up another point. Like, I love the fact that you see this X-Wing coming in, and it's basically Lucas like, I ain't never going back there, but here you go. That made me laugh a lot. Yeah, I roared at that.
Yeah, but
it's had enough sand.
Well, Gareth, what about you in terms of your impressions of the finale and how all that played out?
I think it was a little rushed. I wonder if the decision to put so much Mando content in late in the series was happened late in the process, and that because I think we should have had a lot more time with Cad Bane and Boba.
Yeah,
because he just turns up basically in the last episode and says, "Oh, hi, remember me? Yeah, bang," and I think it could have been a much more emotional journey as part of Boba's development if we had for several episodes there had been flashbacks to him and Boba, going out and causing mayhem, killing people, him teaching Boba Fett, so that the fact that the only way Boba could defeat him in the end was to use a stick that he'd learned. Apart from him, he'd learned something new that Cad Bane had no idea about, and that's what he used to defeat him. So, that should have been set up much earlier in the series. We should have had much more flashbacks, even if it was just, Vader for me as a character was saved by that corridor scene in Rogue One, where he walks down there and Gary, he's a big, heavy breathing Terminator, and he just can't be stopped, and you suddenly think, yes, that's why Ray Vader's scary. And I think we could have had, if we just had that, the corridor scene from Daredevil, but with Boba Fett and Cad Bane, if we just had 2 minutes of that, and we would have said, right, yes, they're lethal killers, we can see what the thing is about, and then to have Boba turn against him and say, no, do you know what? I've grown up now. I'm not into this. And Cad Bane said, well, you can't beat me. And he pulls out a stick and just whacks him. Would have had much more import, I think, if we'd had that set up. But it was good. It was good. I liked Cad Bane. I thought he looked awesome. For a CG face, the teeth looked amazing. And he did look.
I think part of it was practical.
Yeah. He was. I really liked it. But it felt a lot, as we've said, a lot of it felt a little bit soulless in that. Yeah, it's a final confrontation, but we're not heavily invested in the bad guys or their relationship. They're just there to be shot at. So a bit more setup with Cad Bane, I think, would have worked. And if Timothy Oliphant's character is dead, I'm going to flip some tables. I tell you, I want to see.
Cobb Vanth, I love him.
Yeah.
And Gareth, on the notion of Cad Bane, I brought up earlier this idea, like if they had a flashbacks of Boba's days when he was actually murdering people ruthlessly, it could have been cool. They could have built up the tease of Cad Bane, and then towards the end have a very satisfying boom. He like lifts up his head and you see his red eyes and his blue face and his like sharp teeth and everything. And you realize, oh shit, like Boba's been like partnered up with him in these flashbacks the whole time. And it kind of convinces, it would have convinced me more so of the brutality of Boba and his past and Cad Bane and his capabilities, such that when they finally face off against each other and Boba chooses community and more of a peaceful existence, as far as an ex-bounty hunter can do, that would have sold it so much more. And then you would have been like, oh crap, like when he actually defeats and goes against the teachings of Cad Bane, it has much more potency.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, that should have been the arc of the entire season, but from a storytelling point of view. But it is what it is.
From a certain point.
It is what it is. And Jenny, what about you? What were your thoughts on the finale?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Gareth. That was one of my main points that I had on my notes that I took. I just watched it last night, actually, because I was on deadline. Well, I'm still on deadline, but yeah, I think the Cad Bane thing would have been so much more satisfying if, he could have been a real foil and a real reflection of what Boba Fett used to be in the past. So he's forced to look at who he used to be and the ruthlessness he used to have, and then make that active choice to change his ways in that final battle. The other thing about it's kind of a culmination of all the issues I had, I would say, as far as like, okay, like you were saying, like 25 people show up and this is our city. And it's like, but we have no connection to this city, and we don't care about its inhabitants or know why they're even being threatened, really. Like there just wasn't enough like set up, I guess, in that respect for me. And then the Rancor. I loved that so much. Like what Diane was saying, as far as like the choreography of that whole thing, the editing was great. Like the pacing, I think, was even great. Everything really about it was awesome. But the Rancor could have been this great thing that we saw grow along with Boba. Like we see him getting trained, we see him learning empathy for this creature, and therefore learning empathy.
And more time with Danny Trejo.
Yeah, where'd he go?
Right.
Everybody wanted more Danny Trejo, and now he's gone.
Where's Dan?
Yeah, so like I feel like they really missed an opportunity there to like show us that, relationship progressing with this character or this creature that is from this, rustic backwater planet, help them defeat the like shiny new tech syndicate, which was really reflected in the droids and some of the tech that they used, although I think that part could have been done better as well, like from a thematic standpoint. But yeah, I really, really would have liked to see him getting trained on that Rancor. And I'm not talking about like an entire episode dedicated to it, but like show them building that, relationship, and him have that relationship change Boba, and then he comes flying in on the end on it, and it's that much greater of a
it's
thing.
all about a montage. It's just a montage.
Yeah. Good
it's
montage.
Like the Rancor version of Rocky. Like,
yep,
come on,
exactly.
Yeah.
And I saw a really cool theory. I don't know if anyone's watched the Bad Batch animated show.
Some of it. Yeah.
There's a little baby Rancor in that called Moochie. And there's a theory that Boba's new Rancor is actually Moochie.
It's actually Moochie.
That would be cool.
Nice.
Cool. Well, we'll close out. I'll get everyone's final impressions of the show, and also what your hopes are for the future of the Star Wars franchise, since so much of it is in the televised realm, but there are some movies in the pipeline as well. And then how you feel about these TV shows being in the hands of Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni, who are sort of like the two big creative forces behind this now. I guess Robert Rodriguez is big in there now, since he did do so much of this show. So Diane, we'll start with you.
Well, I think the future's bright. That there's a huge playground of opportunity on the small screen where you get to know characters better. Even if it's not perfect, it's still better than the time that you would have on the big screen, and explore the universe and the galaxy a little bit more in depth. Dig into what makes it tick, in pre and post Empire days. I think that we got a feast, right? We're so lucky. We have The Mandalorian. We got another season of that we know is coming, I think, in December. And then we have
Obi-Wan and May.
We have Obi-Wan freaking Kenobi,
back to
which
Tatooine,
honestly
baby.
is the only show I ever wanted to see before The Mandalorian ever came along. That's what I always wanted. I wanted there to be, let's find out what it was like for Obi-Wan before A New Hope, right? And after the Clone Wars. So we got some of that, but I always just wanted to dig into that. And I think because Mandalore has kind of become more of a focus in this era of Star Wars, that I, for one, in Kenobi, want to see some flashbacks to Mandalore and Satine and his relationship with her. And because that was a very interesting dynamic that we never really saw with Obi, right? And like we know he's trying always to set aside attachment, but he clearly loved her. And, how's that? I'm sure for the rest of his life paid for that. Just when he's alone on Tatooine, I want to see some of that again. I want to see them in flashback. And then, having Ahsoka Tano come in multiple times. And I think it's going to be really great to have her kind of explore that sort of middle ground gray area between Jedi and Sith, because she's done with the Jedi essentially, right? So, and she's got her white lightsaber. She's definitely her own. Maybe she is what they all should have been to begin with. Maybe they shouldn't have factioned off. Maybe they could have just been like her, walk a middle path.
Mm-hmm.
So I really can't wait for that. I'm hoping that we do see Kira come in. It makes sense to put her in a Boba Fett show, but she could fit in anywhere in that pantheon, in that era. I can't wait to see Andor. And that's a whole nother facet of Star Wars that we don't know a whole lot about. The Rogue One characters there. And although we know how his story ends, we don't know what his life was like before. It's going to be fun to see a whole new section of the galaxy from that perspective. Looking forward to that. I'm really hoping there is a Boba Fett season 2, like I've said. In Mandalorian, I'm hoping that that we do see more Bo-Katan and some hijinks through that. And obviously, he's going to have to go to Mandalore at some point.
He's got the Darksaber.
With a lot of different things. So I'm really excited. I think it's a good thing in terms of films. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I do feel like we're in a really good position with the small screen. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't mind if that's all we had to, because I think it's a lot of fun, and we get to showcase a lot of different direction styles too. Like I want to see Bryce Dallas Howard direct an episode of every single Star Wars there is, because she knows what she's doing and she's delivered hugely. So that's my take.
Cool. And Gareth, what about you? What final impressions of Boba Fett and sort of how you view the future of the Star Wars franchise?
I feel like we've complained a lot today, but as I said at one point, this is what I wanted Star Wars to be when I was 10 years old. This is the bad guys being bad guys, slightly gritty, living in that used future that really kind of attracted me to episode 4 when it first came out. The fact it wasn't like all set on a pristine Enterprise bridge. It was, there were people walking around and kind of using anti-gravity devices pulled by goats or whatever, because they were trying to exist in this place where everything was breaking down. So I'm looking forward to Obi-Wan, but after The Mandalorian and Boba Fett, I'm slightly worried I might be getting Tatooine fatigue, and wanting to see more of the rest of the universe. But it takes place in a whole different time frame to The Mandalorian and the. Although I strongly suspect Ahsoka will pass through there as well as in a younger version. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to them explaining why he aged so dramatically, whereas none of the other characters.
Tatooine son, man.
Yeah, 2 sons, man.
Yeah. So I'm very optimistic. I was very pessimistic following the last 3 cinematic releases, which just didn't do it for me at all, really. There was a lot of flaws, and I think they drifted far away from Star Wars in a lot of ways. But these TV series are what I want from Star Wars, and I'm really enjoying them. Rebels is, I think, pretty much one of my favorite bits of Star Wars, and now The Mandalorian and Boba Fett. It's so good. It all ties together, and it's nice to see it being built into a universe rather than a haphazard series of films, each one written by somebody else that is kind of a bit patchy. So seeing this kind of created universe being gradually explored is fantastic, I think, and exactly what Star Wars needs.
Yeah, I agree. And also the small screen allows for more experimentation, which is also something that Star Wars needs, because there's less risk in having each individual show sort of explore its own style and narrative choices and character development and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, if something doesn't work, then there's so many other facets of this broader Star Wars universe that are working in a lot of ways. And I love that. I love that Star Wars can experiment like this, just how it used to do a lot more with the expanded universe and the comics and the books and all that kind of stuff. Some of my favorite Star Wars stories, like Rule of Two and all those books by Drew Karpyshyn, are phenomenal.
It's one of my favorite books of all time.
Oh, so good. He also wrote Mass Effect, so of course, Jenny.
Yeah, of course.
But Jenny, we'll get your final impressions as well as your hopes for the future of Star Wars.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with everything Diane and Gareth were saying. I think the future is bright. I think there's a lot of great opportunity. I love the small screen stuff. Big budget movies are great as well. But, you know, I think they need to explore a more Marvel approach to that situation where they give a smart person the reins for the whole situation. Because, yeah, they really screwed that up with the directors in the last three. I think that could have been a good thing. It's just having the three director situation, it was a mess. And then them like basically fighting each other. It was not great. But I would love to see, I definitely agree, Tatooine fatigue. I've always kind of had Tatooine fatigue. I feel like it's the only planet that exists. I get it from a practical perspective because desert shooting is practical right now. It is easy to get a desert setting. It is an easy place to shoot as far
Lighting,
as
all that stuff
COVID
too.
And things like that. Yeah. But yeah, I would like to get away from it a bit and start seeing some other things. In my greatest imagination, I would love for them to head back to the Old Republic. That's always been my favorite era of Star Wars. I love the SWTOR game. I would love to see some of that, and not even necessarily, like, sure, some Jedi focused stuff, but what else was happening during that time of prosperity and peace? Like, what else was going on? Like, there's a ton, and they're doing a lot of that in books and comics, but seeing some of that in, you know, either TV or movie form would be really, really cool. And if they want to adapt the Bane trilogy, please. I would love that more than I might hate it actually. But I would like to see it. If they stick to the books, then I would like it.
Yeah, I agree.
Which
It's like,
I guess,
I love those books so much.
Yeah, and that's kind of, I don't know, like, I know this will never happen because it's Disney, but like R-rated Star Wars would be
great.
So amazing. Like, I would love it so much. Like, and that kind of gets into like the grittier settings. Like we're saying, we all want to see that gritty underbelly, but like even in Boba, where one of the main plot points is drug smuggling, they never say that. They never say drugs. Oh, it's not drug smuggling. And they just kind of like gloss over it completely and can't really get into it because they're trying to make it kid friendly, which I get. But
box of brown powder, it's like,
yeah,
it's more than that, you know. Yeah. But Jenny, I completely agree. And on that note of like the grittier side, I think the High Republic is a setting that they're exploring more, especially in the books.
Yeah, that one looks really interesting.
And then there's a show called The Acolyte that is in pre-development or something along those lines. And that is set in the underbelly of Coruscant, supposedly.
Nice. Cool.
So
yeah, if you guys are interested in the underbelly of Coruscant, the SWTOR video game, the MMO by BioWare, that's a whole thing there. There's a lot more leeway there. They're not connected to the canon at all, so they're just kind of doing whatever they want over there. So it's got some pretty interesting storylines. I haven't played. I'm not up to date by any means, but it's a really good game.
Cool. Yeah, I love the KOTOR games, Knights of the Old Republic.
Yeah, those are great too.
But I haven't played the MMO.
But and like Mandalore, at the height of Mandalore, would be another great thing to see. Which hopefully we'll see maybe some of that in flashbacks. But I'd love to just get a whole thing.
Yeah, me too. Because Gareth, you pointed out that just those quick shots of Mandalore and its destruction and Din Djarin's memories of it, that was super intriguing. It's like, I want to see more of that, because that's the kind of grittiness that we got from something like Rogue One. But doesn't really show up too often. You know, it's like Rogue One was essentially a Vietnam war film set in the Star Wars universe. It's like, I want to see the destruction of Mandalore and how brutal that is and how that connects to Din Djarin and all these other characters.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, Gareth, Diane, Jenny, thank you so much for geeking out with me and talking about Boba Fett. If you could please let listeners and viewers know where they can find you on social media, where they can pick up your books. We'll start with you, Diane.
Well, you can find my website, jdianedotson.com. That's JDIANNEDOTSON.com. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok at Dianne Dotson, JDIANNEDOTSON. On Facebook, my Facebook page is facebook.com/Dianne Dotson Writer. So I'm everywhere. I'm also on LinkedIn. Find me. I'm very active on Twitter, and second to that, probably Instagram. My books can be bought in paperback or ebook form from anywhere in the world, online. Some stores carry them in person, but not very many. And if anybody wants those, signed editions, they can let me know. So I'm out there, and I've got a lot more in the pipeline that's unrelated to the Questerzon saga and dipping more into cosmic horror, as well as into high fantasy and into middle grade fiction as well. So
nice. Thank you, Diane. And Jenny, where can people find you and your work?
Yeah, so my website is jsdewis.com. So that's JSDEWES.com. And then my social is at JSDewis across the board. I'm definitely most active on Instagram, but you'll find me on the other things as well occasionally. And yeah, my books should be available in paperback, ebook, audiobook, wherever books are sold. I think the paperback, it just went to printing again and isn't going to be done until the end of March, but you should be able to get a print on demand via Amazon in the meantime. So, yeah.
Cool. And that's The Last Watch in the Exiled Fleet.
Yes, correct.
Cool. And Gareth, what about you? Where can people find you and your work?
You can find me on Twitter or Instagram as at Gareth L Powell, or you can find me at GarethLPowell.com, where you can find links to all my books and everything else.
Cool. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate you taking the time. And I look forward to having you on again.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.